Okay, ladies and gentlemen, we're on the home run, so let's have a go. First off, can I just remind you about your questionnaires? Please put them on the end of the desk here or at reception. And thank you to those that have filled them in. You have free entrance to the cocktails tonight. Without further ado, we have Robin Mersh, Chief Executive Officer of the Broadband Forum, with a broadband services for the 21st century. And over to Robin. Thank you.
So thank you very much. So I think I've kind of given away the plot for this presentation in that panel. So hopefully I'm not going to repeat anything sort of too much. But I want to go into a little bit more detail in what we were sort of talking about with the drive for new services. So I'll start off with a bit of a, I don't know if this is a controversial thing to sort of say or not. Maybe it is because of that bandwidth discussion we had. But I think the broadband industry just generally, particularly for Western Europe and North America, has technically solved the access problem. So I'm not saying that everyone has all the speeds yet. I'm not saying that everyone has gigabit service. You know, that certainly is the aim, I would say, both from the MSOs and the telco point of view. But technically, we have resolved that issue. So the thing that we started sort of thinking about at the Broadband Forum, you know, probably the first time was sort of a couple of years ago. We kind of sort of saw things on the horizon and started asking ourselves this question. So, you know, what really kind of comes next? What do we need to really kind of concentrate on? And it came down to this issue of services. So if you assume that you've got gigabit access, you know, what the hell do you put on it? And how do you make money out of it? And this has been a very interesting kind of path that we've been on. So I'm going to talk a bit more about Broadband 2020, and you'll like that nice little device we use. So we're talking about vision, of course. It's not exactly about 2020 as a date, because we think that we actually need to deliver a lot of this stuff immediately. I'm going to talk a bit about G.fast. So I know this is kind of interest to you, exactly what the telcos are up to. We play a particular role within G.fast as a technology, but I'll tell you a little bit more about that. Then we'll get into this discussion about enabling services. So particularly, this is about what we call broadband assured IP services. So it is going beyond the idea of best effort and saying, what could we lay on top of this network? And I think this subject has come up a few times. I think, obviously, particularly on this the last panel. So the vision for the organisation. So this is something, as I say, we came up with in the last couple of years. So for ultra-fast technologies, that's kind of our terminology for gigabit. Software delivering new levels of performance and assurance. So these things kind of go, you know, hand in hand. Delivering new high-value services, so on the network as a platform. And that's increasingly the kind of terminology we're using. And that's certainly the terminology we see from a lot of the broadband operators that are members of the organisation. That it's a hybrid ecosystem, so it's certainly, it has certain portions of it are programmable, so SDN driven, you know, with the advent of virtualization. But these networks, as we spoke about on the panel, these are largely brownfield networks. So this has to be delivered in such a way that it's migration ready, that you can easily migrate to the new service, but not leave, obviously, what you have today, because these are obviously revenue-generating services, and that you're leveraging these kind of technologies. 5G we kind of throw in here, because this is certainly a subject of interest to people. I'm not saying I've got an easy answer to this, because I think, you know, it's hard enough to get one definition of 5G that makes sense, but I'm sure if I asked all of you, I'd probably get 20 different answers at least on what 5G is. But we put 5G into the calculation because, largely because of this idea of hyperconnectivity. So for most consumers, what they're asking for is, they obviously want to have the service that they're asking for, but they want it anywhere, anytime. And I kind of agree. I kind of hate that kind of marketing phrase. But there's no doubt that's the way consumers look at it. They don't really tell a difference between if it's Wi-Fi, if it's LTE, if it's over coax, or if it's over twisted pair. They really don't think of any of these as being any different. They just think of it as being broadband. So what do we deliver? Standardized specifications. For architecture, we do software modeling, which is things like we do on TR69, the remote management protocol. We develop Yang data models for managing various kinds of elements. We develop management protocols, implementation guidance. So this is things like best practices for new technologies. We do a lot of interop and conformance testing, mostly in the areas of, so G.fast, GPON, and we also do for TR69. And it's this idea of a kind of step-by-step delivery, because we don't think of ourselves as just being a traditional SDO. We don't develop all of these technologies. So we don't develop, obviously, what goes originally into G.fast or into GPON. What we do is make them deployment ready. That's really our kind of focus, is how to make them actually workable and deployable. And to say just a little bit more about us as an organization. So we have about 150 members. They are probably about a third, actually more than a third, maybe a little bit more than that, who are operators. So that's both MSOs and telcos. We have some pure wireless players as well, as increasingly we're getting into a converged kind of scenario. And basically, it's those operators plus their vendors. So the whole of that value chain. So you're talking about so the chip makers, the CPU vendors, the system vendors, test houses, all of them get involved. Usually driven by the operator community. But I will say I think that's changing. It's changing largely through activities of some of the largest enterprises in the world. So my kind of favorite statistic at the moment is the largest, the company that is buying the largest amount of network equipment in the world is Amazon. So, we all talk about network operators, but who's to say they aren't a network operator? They have their own networks. They do also use portions of data centers run by telcos and MSOs, but they stand alone as a very large network in their own right. You can throw Facebook into that. You can sort of throw, a Netflix. That's another good example. You look at Alibaba in China. I think those guys are going to increasingly be running the kind of requirements that drive the work of organizations like the Broadband Forum. Now, I won't sort of say that I have them in membership today. Some of them are. So Google are members. But I think this is something that you're going to see shaping in the industry as we move forward. Certainly the vendors want it to go that way, because obviously they want to influence what's going on with part of their customer base. But anyway, let me move on. So putting G.fast into a bit of context, and I think you could very easily kind of substitute DOCSIS 3.1 for G.fast. There is an effect on everything that is going on within the broadband industry. So it directly affects what's going on in the intelligent home or the smart home. In terms of seamless connectivity is being driven by gigabit. Personalized network service, that potentially is going to be impacted. I won't say it exists today, but I think we are going in a direction where you could truly have personalized network service. I know that question kind of was skirted around a little bit in the on the panel, but I think when it comes down to what does gigabit service really give us, it enables many other things to happen. So in and of itself, I actually think it's kind of, and again, this is a bit controversial, but I think it's kind of boring. To talk about G.fast or DOCSIS 3.1 or 5G on their own is kind of a boring subject, because most consumers would sort of say, Well, I don't really care about the pipe. What I care about are the services that I'm getting delivered to me. And that's what we should be interested in as an industry, because that's what you can actually monetize. You know, the connection itself only takes you so far. What gives you the added kind of value are the actual services. So what are we doing in the G.fast space? So it is an important enabler, so don't take me wrong in my statement. I do think it's very important, but it enables. It doesn't actually deliver the value itself. So for G.fast interoperability has been something that the Broadband Forum has worked on for a very long time, but not just in the G.fast area. We actually came into existence originally to deliver DSL. So originally ADSL. In fact, we were originally called the ADSL Forum. Then we kind of morphed into the DSL Forum, then eventually into the Broadband Forum. But the first kind of reason why we existed was not to change the technology itself. You know, it was actually to make it deployable. So one of the issues about deployability was interop, because I don't know how much you remember about those early days of DSL, but at that point, pretty much what you were being delivered by the vendors was a bookended solution. It wasn't open. It meant that it was more expensive. It was more complex. It changed some of the rules in terms of how would you put together a business plan for deploying DSL. So first of all, we were set this task of improving interoperability so that the operators could run a multi-vendor RFP process. So I think we were very successful at that, maybe for two reasons. One, we did that with DSL, but the second thing we did was develop TR69, which enabled to reduce truck rolls in deployments. And truck rolls, I know, has been a big sort of subject in a lot of the discussions this morning. But that's the reason why we developed TR69 was to really reduce that problem. But anyway, getting back to the interoperability issue, that was the kind of the second part of it. So interop and zero truck roll. So we've been very successful, but the challenge with G.fast, well, in one sense, it was a very good thing that we decided to do this even before G.fast had chips. So today, there are chips actually in trials and actually in kind of quite large field trials. But when we decided to do the certification, none of that kind of existed. Now, that caused us quite a problem in a lot of ways, that when we developed the testing for DSL and for GPON, you were already talking about a mature technology, and you were talking about deployments that were already sort of fairly large. So we were kind of retrospectively putting together an interoperability plan, which made things in a lot of ways a bit easier. G.fast meant that, you know, because we were developing it on chips that were being developed, it hasn't been the easiest thing in the world. I'll sort of be totally upfront about that. But it's been very positive because it means that we're actually developing a market as we speak. So it has been been going pretty well. We've had a number of plug fests, as it says up there. There's been 3 in 2015 and 3 this year. There's actually a lot more planned for this year, and we also have an ongoing virtual program. Now that's different to obviously to what you guys sort of do. I mean, your testing can go largely through places like Cable Labs, but I think the model that you followed at times has been there's been a good deal of envy from the telcos in that they wish that they could have something quite as well organised as that, but is the nature of the telco industry has just not really been so kind of easy to follow that path. But anyway, so the Broadband Forum has kind of played that role. We have done very well in terms of developing these plans. The G.fast certification will show compliance to BBF standards. So that's basically one test plan that we put together. There are a number of optional and mandatory tests within that list. This is all based off of the fact that we had to make some choices in the G.fast standard. So G.fast was obviously developed by the ITU-T. Anyone that knows anything about the way the ITU-T generally delivers standards is that it's a fairly political organisation. It's a UN organisation, so pretty much any requirements that are put forward by their membership will go into that standard. Now, what that can mean is that it's not quite so deployable from day one. So one of the first tasks that we needed to go through was to go through the specs and say what things that we thought were mandatory for that testing. So we have done that. We have a certain number of optional tests as well, but compliance will be compliance to the mandatory elements. You can see some of this on the Broadband Forum website. Not necessarily the tests themselves, but you can certainly see the kind of things that we mandate within that program. It is about reducing costs. It's about accelerating the time to market. And with any kind of certification, obviously you're trying to create a trusted list of devices. Now, pretty much all of the companies involved in G.fast have products within the beta program. The beta testing is happening now. When we deliver this, I kind of expect there to be, probably about 20 companies originally will be involved in the announcement. I can't sort of say for sort of certain because obviously we're in beta testing, but that would be my kind of best guess at where we get to, probably at some time by the end of the year. It'd be something like 20 companies involved. I don't know how many products because there are obviously a lot more products than that, but it really depends on how many cycles we can go through. But I expect it to be quite a large announcement to make. Okay, so enabling services. So one of the things probably sort of talk about a little bit is fibre to the distribution point. So this was the original thinking about deploying G.fast, was the idea of how you would deliver gigabit into consumers' homes, whether they were MDUs or SDUs, depending on whether they're kind of over-the-air delivery or underground. But originally that was the kind of sort of thinking was you would need to pull fibre as close as possible to the consumer, maybe within sort of 100 to 50 metres. As it's kind of turning out now, if you look at all of the operators that are talking about deploying G.fast, there are certainly some that are going down the fibre to the DP route. But certainly not all. As you would have sort of seen with some of the things that BT are doing, they're actually looking at fibre to the cabinet. Now, this is all obviously a trade-off between how far you pull the fibre, exactly where those consumers are, what the demographics look like, and what kind of speed you want to deliver immediately. But some of the testing for fibre to the cabinet has really been quite impressive. I think I would, without sort of saying the numbers sort of directly, I would say it's very, very similar to what you talk about with DOCSIS 3.1 today. So a very sort of similar kind of approach. Now, I mean, as we sort of see this being played out, how many operators deploy with fibre to the cabinet and how many with fibre to the DP? Your guess is as good as mine. But I would sort of say that, if you already have a lot of fibre delivered to the cabinet, then the temptation to go down that path is going to be quite high. One, because you've already deployed it, of course, but the second thing is it also resolves a lot of the power issues because, of course, you already have power in the cabinet. But, anyway, like I say, I don't want to kind of particularly sort of guess on it, but I can imagine that it's going to be quite attractive. Some of the work that we've sort of done, so we've done various sort of documents. There's an overall architecture document we delivered. We've been looking at so the cable models. We've looked at obviously the certification test plan itself, and then the requirements around the test plan and the beta testing. And then we have a number of works in progress, probably the biggest ones being around the Yang data models for managing fibre to the DPUs. And in fact, those DPUs, maybe that's a little bit misleading. It's actually DPUs full stop. It's not just DPUs for fibre to the DP. It would actually be whether they were in the cabinet or not. But this is a large piece of work that we're sort of doing. How much of this sort of gets delivered in a virtualized way will be interesting to see. Okay, so let's kind of get into this discussion on sort of services and where our sort of thinking's been going. So generally, this is the idea that it's the broadband assured IP services, which is delivered in kind of, and has various different issues associated with it. So some of it you could sort of say is to do with data center interconnect. It's certainly not just an access issue. Some elements are around it being a converged network, so it's wireless and wireline equally. It's talking about things like IoT secure access, so this could be for things like, I don't know, like health services or for sort of security. There's a number of other sort of things. I'm sure we could all sort of like think about it, where these are the kind of sort of services that need a level of assurance above and beyond best effort. And that's kind of the point, really. We're not talking just best effort here. It certainly could be IPVPN connection orientated kind of sort of services. So that could go for, particularly for business broadband kind of users. And if you were to sort of think about the kind of communities that could be interested here, I think some of the obvious ones, you know, business broadband is certainly one. If you look at kind of your typical Ethernet business connections, Ethernet business connections generally are kind of very expensive. And ironically, the biggest service for business Ethernet is internet. It's just basic internet service. So it kind of occurs to us, it's like, well, wouldn't that be interesting? Wouldn't that be an interesting thing to actually replace? Is instead of sort of thinking about that you do it on business broadband. But the problem today is that business broadband doesn't mean very much. Business broadband is basically, as we all know, is basically a telephone. It's you're given a phone number to call to complain if your broadband service is down. But you don't necessarily get anything more than a residential consumer would get. But what if you change that? What if you could change it and you said something like, you know, for some of the largest corporations out there, anything up to 40% of their workers work from home. If you could turn around and say to them, well, one, we're going to make your service clearly defined so that it was available anywhere in the world on a very similar definition. Because, you know, I guarantee you, if you talk to any of the big enterprises, one of the biggest complaints they have, if they are in multiple countries, is that they can't actually order the same service from 2 countries, let alone from, say, 100, which some of these large corporations work in. Not being able to order the same service is a real pain. It's not just a sort of difficult from a management sort of point of view, but it's also just difficult from the fact that you have SLAs in place for like maybe 100 different SLAs globally. So it can be a real pain. It can also be very expensive. So I think so. That's sort of like one idea. So it's good from the business's point of view, but it's also good from the user point of view, because again, any of you that have worked from home and you've ever done a WebEx from home, or you've ever done business Skyping from home, you know that service is not at all reliable. Yes, mostly it will not fall over, but there's no guarantees that it won't fall over. And you know, the irony was when I did a presentation on this, we did a light reading webinar. I was supposed to be the one introducing this webinar. It was like we had about 300-400 people on the call to talk about this very subject, and my line went down. My broadband connection completely collapsed, and thank goodness I was on there with 2 colleagues, and my colleague kind of picked it up. But it was this kind of perfect example of what the problem is that, you know, even in that sort of situation, is like there's nothing you can do about it. There was no guarantee of service. So everyone I've kind of talked to about this on the enterprise side has all been very enthusiastic. The people that may be a little bit less enthusiastic have been, well, I mean, a couple of the operators have been a bit nervous, because what they don't want to do is cannibalize any of their current services. But I would argue, I think, well, actually, there's maybe 2 reasons why not to think of it that way. One is there's really very little choice. because most of the operators I know are already in discussions where it's such a competitive market that they're having to reduce their costs for their business services. So why not sort of think about a more cost-effective way of doing it? But secondly, there are a large number of business users on consumer networks today who would absolutely jump at the chance of having quality assured service if they could. So that's one example, is business broadband. Another one would be, I mean, there's some fairly obvious ones, I suppose, like things like gaming services. So those are obviously services that are they're not just bandwidth hungry, they're also very hungry in terms of, latency and jitter and all those kind of other sort of things where quality service is important. It's also an area where consumers are willing to spend money. They certainly spend money on online services. So if you could offer them a premium, I think that would be another interesting one. Another one for sure is things like security services. I think e-health certainly is a very interesting one. But one thing you'll notice about this is part of it is a technical discussion, because there are technical things we need to resolve. But the other side of this is very much a business issue. This is going to demand a certain level of business discussion that makes some of these things possible. And there's maybe a third thing I should, fairly obviously mention at this point is regulation. But we have a way round of this. And we have thought about the regulatory issue. So first of all, we think there is pent-up demand for these kind of services. So from the ones that I kind of mentioned, it's revenue generating, and this is kind of a very important point to make, is that of all the business executives I talk to in the operators, the one thing you hear over and over again, in fact, virtually every single presentation I think I've seen from an operator for the last few years has talked about the same issue about, you've got on the one sort of side bandwidth going up exponentially, and then the bottom part of the graph is ARPU nosediving and getting worse. So unless we make a change to this, unless we develop revenue generating services that can go over the top of what we currently have, and I don't mean over the top in a business model, just what can be laid on top of this network. If you don't do that, it's basically a race to the bottom, and the operators will just become dumb pipes. Now, I don't think most really want to go down that path, so that's part of the sort of thinking. So we think there's pent-up demand basically on both sides. The question is how you do this. Now, the physical bandwidth is an important part of it, so I don't mean to kind of say that the bandwidth isn't important. When I said about it being an enabler, this is kind of one of the things I mean, is that if you had gigabit service, then you can do certain things with that connectivity into the home that can make quite a difference. So if you look at sort of some of what's sort of like up on this sort of screen already, you can sort of see this whole kind of sort of thing about these different services that are on this very, very kind of ugly GUI. So we're obviously not saying that's what a GUI would look like in the consumer's home eventually, but it's just basically this idea that you could click on something to make it premium assured. So some things, you would want, you just want best effort and you're not bothered. But there'll be other sort of things where you do want it to be premium assured. And of course, you need to have a mechanism in here that, one, enables the service, but second, obviously, is billing is an important kind of question. But we also sort of think of this as being very sort of similar to what you talk about with iPhone services. I mentioned, earlier on the sort of panel that, we all pretty much have smartphones these days, and you kind of, we don't even really sort of think about adding on new services. One of the things we don't have, though, today is we don't really have a very customer-friendly way of, we don't have the same screen available, or we don't use the same screens that are available on an iPhone in the home. It's one of the things I think we do need to sort of change, is this idea that the customer portal is a very important sort of feature. And I think the reason why it's probably not seen as being that critical today is that most consumers will get their services on just the TV guide. That's all they really go to. They just think of this as being, TV services. They don't think of it being beyond that, and I think that's one of the things we probably do need to change to some extent. So if you did have that in place, and let's say you click on it and you go premium assured, then how is that enabled across the sort of network? Now, obviously what we're sort of doing here is you're using some of the bandwidth for assured services, and the important point about this, the reason why it has to be done that way, one is that it obviously means you can make it an assured service because it's guaranteed bandwidth. It's also that it's separated from the best effort internet because obviously there's regulatory issues. If you were to just cannibalize the service and it was basically just internet service, then there'd be all kinds of issues with Ofcom or the FCC or any of the other regulators. So that's what we're sort of like thinking as being the first step, is that you enable it into the consumer's premise. One of the things that really could enable this happening is what's happening for most COs. If you've seen what's kind of going on with projects like Chord in the US, and now Chord's been looked at actively by a number of different operators, both within the US and outside. But basically this idea that you re-architect the CO to be a data center. If you were to sort of do that, then you've got this short hop from the home where you can guarantee this bandwidth. We think that is a very effective way of sidestepping some of the regulatory issues. I mean, of course, the other sort of point about this is that you're not forcing the consumer to do this. This is a conscious decision that they're making. And, you know, the other sort of thing that you could probably put into this scenario is that just because the consumer is saying that they want premium assured, it doesn't mean necessarily that they're the ones paying for the service. The service could be being delivered by, let's say, if it was Netflix or some over-the-top provider, it could be that they are charging a premium rate to that consumer, and then they're paying the network operator to use this path. Now, that conscious decision by the consumer and the relationship between the operator and the over-the-top provider is the key point. So effectively what you end up with here is the network as a service. I mean, that's really the kind of the sort of bottom line here, is that the network becomes a platform. So it's not just a dumb pipe, it's a very smart pipe. You're not necessarily delivering all of these services, but you could certainly be offering it to third party. Now, the thing that seems attractive from our point of view is obviously over the top is happening anyway. So it's not like you're actually enabling anything that is happening already. What you are doing, though, is finding a way of monetizing it. Okay, so what's some of the sort of differences between the two, between best effort and performance assured? So we're talking about it being, it's inherently secure and private. Obviously, that's not true with best effort. It's a standardized service, which is certainly not true with internet services. As we know, internet services are not standardized. It's scalable. It has protections. We think it certainly is compliant. It has management. And the important points with SDN and NFV is that some of the programmability that we're now talking about with the advent of SDN, this could be a real way that you could make a difference in the network. So not only is it programmable and can be just switched on more easily, it can actually be revenue generating. So for the end users, we sort of see it as being, we do see the demand for assured services, that it's agile, so it can be always on, but it can come up much, much faster. It's ultra fast, of course, so quality of experience is the important line. Internet of Things, well, I mean, there's lots of things you can imagine being enabled sort of through this. You know, I mentioned the ideas around e-health. You know, it's sort of funny. I think of, when I first came into telecoms, I think the two things that everyone talked about the most. So I joined soon after Mercury being formed, I started working for Mercury. And two of the things that we talked about the most was video on demand and e-health. Now, video on demand obviously eventually became a reality, but as we know, video on demand for the longest time got nowhere, you know, and was a real struggle. E-health really amazes me that it hasn't sort of taken off, but maybe the real reason why it hasn't taken off has been this idea of the reliability of the network, that there just hasn't been enough bandwidth into the home, that it hasn't been quality assured. Now, imagine a situation where there was enough bandwidth, it could be quality assured. The only thing I think that's missing from this is probably a commercial relationship between the health provider and the operator. But I think this could be the kind of scenario where that could happen. For the from the operators, as I say, you know, this story is already happening. Over the top is increasingly an issue from an operator perspective, and it's certainly something that you just cannot monetize. It's I remember sort of talking to the BT guys. I mean, this actually came out of a presentation that they gave. I think it was maybe last year or the year before, but they were talking about that bandwidth kind of chart. So they showed that whole thing about bandwidth going up exponentially and ARPU dropping. And when they were asked the question, because there was obviously a lot of non-Brits there. This was a European conference, and they were asked what was driving all of that content and why couldn't they monetize it. And of course, the answer was it was the iPlayer. It was the BBC iPlayer that was driving all of that. And there was no way you could monetize it. It was just going to be an impossibility. And I'm sure it's probably similar for Virgin Media or sort of Sky Broadband. I'm sure you all kind of suffer the same thing, that a lot of the content is coming from places like the iPlayer. So anyway, I mean, so this problem, it is sort of like happening anyway. So why not find a way of getting around it and actually making it much more friendly to the sort of telcos and the MSOs. The application providers, we think there is a sell to these guys, because yes, they get the service already on best effort, but do they sell premium services already? They do, but they don't necessarily have a real kind of obvious path as yet for it to be able to be monetized at a higher level. So we think that has quite a sort of possibility. And maybe with people like sort of, you know, health providers, I can't help but sort of think, you know, with somebody like the NHS, you know, we know that there are increasing demands on organisations like that, and the NHS aren't alone. I think you could probably go to any country and they would say the same thing. If you could reduce the demand on their services and you could do it more virtually, then why wouldn't you? You know, why wouldn't that be a good path to go down? And I think that is worth money. That is something very, very real. For the equipment manufacturers, you know, a lot of people sort of talk about NFV and SDN being a kind of a nightmare for the system vendors, because this is kind of undermining their old business model. But we think that as well could be turned around, because the major problem that they're facing is not that dissimilar to the operators, that the cake of telcos is just, and telco services is just, it's been seen as being finite, you know, that you're never going to be able to layer new services on top of best effort internet. But what if you could? What if you could make that cake much bigger? What if you could develop these new services? Then from a system vendor point of view, certainly from you know, chip vendors' point of view, that could be a very attractive proposition. So, oh, sorry, didn't mean to do that. Thank you. Lastly, into the sort of business relationships. Now, I mean, as an organisation, we don't drive these business relationships, so this is kind of just ideas about where some of this could go to and where some of these discussions need to happen. But you know, obviously, this needs to be enabled. There needs to be, you know, the right kind of portals put in place. There needs to be the right kind of support for them. Obviously, there's billing issues. There's all kinds of other things that kind of come into it. So it's not to kind of, you know, to minimise any of this. You know, the commercial relationships are very important, but we can point to them, but probably not sort of too much sort of further than that. But I would really encourage these discussions to happen. I certainly know that enterprises are talking about it, and I certainly know that operators are, but I would say roll on the day that this becomes a lot more open, because I think technically we still have a lot of work to do. Now, quickly, the last sort of two I'll sort of talk about. So this idea of seamless connectivity, one of the things that we think is most likely to happen through NFV and SDN being used in the networks is that you could truly get converged services. We fully expect this to sort of happen. We're already having a lot of discussions internally about how you would map wireless networks against wireline networks. So, you know, again, whether they were cable or telco is almost irrelevant, because the two networks really are very similar these days. But how would you map wireless and wireline together? There's obviously a lot of very good reasons why this is being driven. These are very active conversations. But I think there's an angle that maybe people don't talk about. They talk about this idea that converging the core networks for wireless and wireline are kind of obvious. And maybe they are. Just purely on an engineering level, they're fairly obvious. But there's some really interesting things that come out the back of it. So if you truly could have hyper-connected service, then you could avoid, you know, issues with sort of dropped calls and those kind of issues that come up. You could turn people's service up much faster. You know, for instance, you know, if you were, say, you know, people talked earlier about if you had a box that was delivered to you from a broadband operator to turn service up, you know, wouldn't that be a good thing? Couldn't it be much faster than waiting for a truck roll? Well, what if you took it one step back? What if you said, when you ordered the service, that you could immediately enable the service on your iPhone? There's no reason why you couldn't actually have that connection immediately. And then why not, as a next step, let's say that your broadband service goes down, your wireline network goes down, that you could seamlessly go onto the wireless network. There's no reasons why a lot of these things couldn't happen. Again, some of it is to do with the fact that we just haven't really kind of ever got to the converged services area. There's been lots of promise about fixed mobile convergence, but we've never actually really done it. But that now is much more possible through the advent of NFV, and as I say, a lot of these discussions are already happening. And then, you know, you could imagine a whole load of new services coming on the back of it if you truly had hyperconnectivity. Intelligent home and business services, now this is sort of something that we've kind of worked on for a very long time, and there's obviously relationships to business assured broadband that I talked about earlier. But a lot of this kind of builds on top of the kind of things we've done around TR69. We have a huge footprint in installations on TR69, a large amount in the MSO space, as much as anywhere. But we are now developing the next generation of TR69 to go beyond just internet services and TV, to really look at IoT and virtualized services. So, and it's interesting, you know, you do get operators kind of speaking about both sort of things. You either get some operators are talking about virtualizing services within the network, or you get completely the other point of view, where it's actually almost making the home network into like a small data center. So some people talk from that angle. And it's interesting, the regulation kind of plays a role in both of those scenarios. Some regulators, without a doubt, are kind of much more kind of paranoid when it comes to privacy. So they tend to be talking about not putting services into the network because they think it's inherently unsafe. Now, I'm not saying I agree with that, because I actually think, I'm not sure that's at all true. But just to sort of say that there are kind of trends in both directions. So I'm not convinced that virtualization is going to lead to dumb boxes in the home, you know, or that it goes exactly the other way. I think you're probably going to see a mix of both things kind of happening. Okay, so for 2016, as I sort of said, you know, there's, you know, we have 150 members. These are the kind of number of standards we do, or technical contributions, sorry, annually. So about 1,200. So it's a very, very active organisation. We have about 200 standards already approved. These are some of the projects we have for this year. And I would, just to sort of say, I would kind of encourage, involvement in what we sort of like do. You know, for the longest time, the Broadband Forum was a telco organisation. We were driven, as I said originally, by kind of DSL and overcoming the problem with DSL. But when we developed TR69 to reduce truck rolls, we actually consciously developed TR69 as access agnostic. It doesn't matter whether that connection is you know, coax, fibre to the home, even wireless. Because there are some fixed wireless installations I can think of that actually use TR69. And I would sort of say that just as an organisation, we've kind of followed that path of being much more kind of open to the kind of problems that actually affect both types of operator. And in fact, the interesting thing, virtually every presentation I've seen by an MSO for the last sort of few years, you could very easily, if you squinted your eyes and just ignored the fact that it said Comcast at the top, it looks just like AT&T or just like Verizon. The difference between the networks is, I think, becoming less and less. And I think that should encourage us to work together even more. Even if there are some differences in access. And you know, obviously we're going to be deploying G.fast and there's more fibre to the home. But that last mile shouldn't detract from the fact that actually our kind of the footprint, it looks very similar, and we certainly have some very sort of similar issues that we're trying to resolve. Okay, so these are some of the sort of projects we have. I'll let you sort of read that at your leisure, and thank you very much.
For that. Most intriguing stuff there. Thank you. Any questions, please, for Robin? I think you've answered all the questions by the look of it, Robin. Just say thank you.
Thank you.
All right.